In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of much of Europe, decided to invade Russia. He brought with him a massive army, over 600,000 men, the largest force Europe had ever seen. He was confident, perhaps too confident. He believed he would win quickly, in a few months, before winter came. But Russia didn't fight like other countries. They kept retreating, burning their own towns and crops as they went. This strategy, scorched earth, left Napoleon's army cold, hungry, and confused. Then winter arrived, and it was brutal. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Horses froze standing up. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags. Many just sat down and never got up again. By the time Napoleon ordered a retreat, it was too late. His army, the Grande Armée, fell apart. Starvation, cold, disease, constant attacks from Russian forces. Of the 600,000 men who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it out. It wasn't just a defeat, it was the beginning of the end for Napoleon. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. He expected a quick victory. Blitzkrieg had worked elsewhere. Why not in Russia? At first, it worked. German forces surged forward, capturing vast Soviet land. But Hitler made a fatal mistake. He underestimated Russia's size, people, and winter. The Wehrmacht wasn't equipped for sub-zero temperatures. Soldiers wore summer uniforms. Engines froze, guns jammed, fuel turned to slush. The Soviets retreated deep into their territory, a tactic they'd used against Napoleon. Then winter arrived, with brutal, punishing cold. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. German troops froze in trenches. Many lacked proper boots. Some wrapped their feet in newspaper. Frostbite, starvation, and disease became more dangerous than Soviet bullets. Meanwhile, Soviet forces regrouped and counterattacked fiercely. Siberian divisions, trained for winter, pushed the Germans back. Hitler refused to let his troops retreat. Thousands died from exposure alone. The roads became frozen graveyards of tanks and trucks. What was meant to be a quick campaign turned into a drawn-out disaster. By the end, Hitler had opened a two-front war, the very thing he had sworn to avoid. Operation Barbarossa failed. Millions died. And all because of a decision driven by arrogance, not strategy. It was the morning of October 25, 1854. British forces were in Crimea, facing off against Russian troops. The British High Command spotted Russian troops seizing artillery in the valley. A message was quickly written to order a cavalry charge, but the message was vague. Very vague. The order simply said, advance rapidly to the front and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Commander Lord Lucan didn't ask questions, he obeyed. But he misunderstood which guns the order referred to. Instead of attacking the nearby guns on the hills, the cavalry was sent charging straight down a valley lined with Russian cannons. It was a deadly trap. The Light Brigade rode with bravery. 600 men against overwhelming fire. Cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them, cannon in front of them. They reached the end of the valley, but with massive losses. Many died, some returned, but the mistake was clear. The order was misunderstood. No one clarified. The British command had sent brave men into certain death over a communication error. It became a lesson in miscommunication, forever etched in history, and immortalized in poetry, a tribute to courage and a warning of confusion. The Gallipoli campaign was meant to be a swift, decisive move to defeat the Ottoman Empire and secure a route to Russia. But the planning was overly optimistic intelligence was thin and logistics were underestimated. The Allied forces landed far from their intended beaches due to navigational errors. Many found themselves at the bottom of steep cliffs, facing entrenched Ottoman forces above. The defenders had been warned, and surprise was completely lost. Commanders underestimated how difficult the terrain would be. Narrow beaches, rocky hills, and heat. Supplies backed up on beaches vulnerable to artillery and sniper fire. Communications between naval and land forces were inconsistent and outdated. Attempts to push inland failed repeatedly, often at human cost. Trench warfare set in, and with it, disease, heat, and misery. Soldiers endured months of hell with minimal gains. The Ottomans, under Mustafa Kemal, defended fiercely, even as both sides suffered staggering losses. In late 1915, the Allies finally evacuated under the cover of darkness. The campaign had failed. Over 100,000 soldiers were dead with nothing to show for it. Gallipoli became a symbol of leadership failure, national grief, and the cost of imperial ambition. In Australia and New Zealand, Anzac Day became a solemn commemoration of those lost at Gallipoli. The Ottoman defense turned Mustafa Kemal into a national hero, later known as Ataturk. Gallipoli left scars on maps, on nations, and on the future of modern warfare. It was a peaceful Sunday morning in Hawaii. The sun was rising gently over Pearl Harbor. On the decks of battleships, sailors lounged, reading newspapers and chatting idly. At a radar station on Oahu, a pair of young soldiers stared at a strange blip on their screen. They were seeing a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. Concerned, they called their supervisor, but he told them it was probably just American B-17s arriving from the mainland. Meanwhile, just outside the harbor, a Japanese submarine was surfacing quietly. It was spotted, and the destroyer USS Ward fired at it, sinking it just outside the harbor entrance. This was reported up the chain of command, but no one reacted with urgency. There was no general alert issued. No one at the harbor was told to prepare. Moments later, Japanese planes soared over the mountains, dozens of them in attack formation. They released their first wave of bombs, falling fast and silent from the sky. Torpedoes raced through the harbor water, aimed precisely at the anchored ships. The USS Arizona took a direct hit. It exploded violently, sending fire and debris skyward. Across the harbor, chaos unfolded. Ships ablaze, men diving into the water, alarms finally ringing. In the smoke and confusion, sailors helped one another, pulling the injured to safety. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Many would never sail again. By the end of the attack, over 2,400 Americans were dead. The flag flew at half-mast over the harbor. And yet, warning signs had been there, on paper, on radar, in reports. But assumptions and disbelief clouded judgment. It was simply too unthinkable. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed the nation. It would become known as a date which will live in infamy. In March 2003, the United States launched a massive invasion of Iraq. It began with a campaign known as Shock and Awe. The goal was clear: remove Saddam Hussein from power. And the military campaign succeeded, quickly. Within weeks, Baghdad fell. But that's where the planning stopped. There was no detailed blueprint for what would come after. No clear roadmap for rebuilding a country. Key institutions like the military and the police were immediately disbanded. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were left jobless. These decisions, made quickly by American administrators, created a power vacuum. Looting broke out across Baghdad. Museums, ministries, and hospitals were emptied. Iraqis asked, "Where are the Americans?" There was no plan to protect vital infrastructure. Then came the insurgency. discontent brewed into armed resistance. Sunni and Shia tensions exploded. Sectarian violence spread through neighborhoods. American soldiers, trained for war, not peacekeeping, were overwhelmed. Roadside bombs, IEDs, became a daily threat. Convoys had no safe path. In 2004, the city of Fallujah became a battlefield. Insurgents dug in. The war turned into an occupation, and then into something even worse, a civil war. Each year brought more deaths, more divisions, and no clear end. The U.S. struggled to define its mission. Was it liberation? Stabilization? Nation building? By 2007, a surge of new troops helped reduce some violence. But the deeper damage had already been done. The war cost trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives. There had been no weapons of mass destruction. The core justification for the war had vanished. The biggest mistake wasn't the invasion itself. It was walking in with no plan for peace. In June 1876, the U.S. Army marched into Montana Territory. Their mission? Subdue the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne tribes. The commander was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Brash, bold, and overconfident. He believed he'd surprise a small group of native warriors. But that wasn't what awaited him. Thousands of native fighters had gathered near the Little Bighorn River, led by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gull. This wasn't a surprise attack. It was a deadly underestimation. Custer split his forces into 3 parts, a fatal decision. He led about 210 men straight into the largest native force they'd ever faced. The terrain offered little cover, and the native warriors fought fiercely. Custer's men were quickly overwhelmed. There was no time to retreat. Within an hour, every man in Custer's group was dead. Not one survived to tell the tale. Back east, the news stunned the country. A national hero had been defeated. The U.S. government responded swiftly, sending in more troops to crush resistance. In the end, the native victory was short-lived, but for a moment, it shook the American frontier. Custer's last stand became mythologized, told in books, songs, and paintings. But the reality was less heroic and far more tragic. A battle won by those trying to defend their way of life, and lost by those who never imagined they could lose. The Vietnam War began as a mission to stop communism from spreading, but it soon became something much harder to control. American leaders thought it would be a short, winnable war. They underestimated the enemy. The Viet Cong didn't fight like a regular army. They struck from shadows, then vanished. Tunnels, booby traps, and ambushes were their tools, not tanks or jets. U.S. forces brought high-tech weapons, but they didn't know who the enemy really was. Every village might hide a fighter. Every child might be a scout. Fighting an invisible enemy wore down morale and turned trust into paranoia. The terrain itself fought back. Dense jungle, monsoon rains, leeches, disease. Helicopters roared over the treetops, but couldn't hold the ground below. Massive bombing campaigns scarred the land, but did little to change the war's outcome. Villages were burned, hearts and minds were lost. For every victory, there was another ambush. For every base, another retreat. Many Americans back home began to question it all. The war they saw on TV didn't look like a victory. Even with overwhelming firepower, the U.S. couldn't defeat an enemy that never fought fair. Guerrilla warfare wasn't just a tactic, it was a mindset, a survival strategy. The U.S. left Vietnam in 1973. 2 years later, Saigon fell. The war cost over 58,000 American lives and millions more in Southeast Asia. It was a war that couldn't be won with bullets alone, and one that taught hard lessons in humility. 1961, the U.S. launched a secret plan to invade Cuba, but almost everything went wrong. The idea? train Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro. The CIA believed the Cuban people would rise up, but they didn't. The plan was kept secret, but not secret enough. The invaders landed at the Bay of Pigs, but help never came. Air support was promised, then canceled. Castro's forces struck fast. The beach turned into a trap. In less than 3 days, over 1,000 were captured. The invasion failed. It was a global embarrassment. President Kennedy took the blame, but the damage was done. The failed invasion pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union. It deepened Cold War tensions. It was a clear lesson. Covert operations don't guarantee control. The exiles had trained for victory, but were abandoned when it mattered most. Cuba would remain under Castro's rule, and the U.S. would face the consequences. Just 1 year later, the world nearly faced nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs wasn't just a failed invasion. It was a spark that lit a fuse. It showed that even superpowers could make costly mistakes in front of the whole world. And it reminded leaders that sometimes secrecy makes failure worse. In early 1968, the U.S. focused its eyes on a remote base called Sanh. They believed it was the key to stopping a massive North Vietnamese assault. Surrounded by hills and jungle, Sanh was isolated. But America chose to make a stand there. The North Vietnamese began encircling the base with thousands of troops. It looked like another Dien Bien Phu. But Sanh was different. The U.S. had air superiority, and they planned to use it. Massive airstrikes pounded enemy positions. The base held. The U.S. sent in thousands of tons of supplies by air. It became a battle of attrition. While the siege dragged on, something else happened. The Tet Offensive erupted across South Vietnam. Cities were under attack. Sanh had distracted U.S. attention. The real plan? A countrywide shock. The U.S. believed Sanh was the main event, but it was a diversion. The siege eventually ended. North Vietnamese forces simply left. But by then, the Tet Offensive had shaken American confidence. Sanh cost hundreds of lives, but achieved little. Shortly after the siege, the U.S. abandoned the base. The mistake wasn't defending Sanh, it was overestimating its importance. The real battle was for public opinion, and America was losing it. Sanh became a symbol, not of victory, but of distraction. It showed how war can be misread, and how the enemy could outthink the world's most powerful army.